Hello, my name is Steve Gearhart, and this is the Unagi Observer. This is the start of a series of videos called Where to Eat for Otakon 2018. For those who are not familiar with this series, I do this every year for Otakon. These videos provide tips for things like how to get to Otakon, parking, where to stay, as well as to showcase nearby cheap eats and convenience stores. These videos will go right up until the final week before Otakon. I was going to wait a couple more weeks before starting, but I decided to start a bit early. This week's video will deal with safety around Otakon in Washington, D.C. Otakon has on its website some good advice, and the links for that are down below. I'm just going to expand on those ideas. Okay, let's start. These days, there is a lot of concern over safety when attending Otakon. It is a worry of parents everywhere, so this video is just as much for the parents as it is for the otakus attending Otakon. First, let me start by saying that there is a significant differences between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. But before I talk about those things, let me first address the fact that, like Baltimore, Washington, D.C. is also a city. I know that sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but there is a reason why I am pointing that out. Now, many parents felt good about the move from Baltimore to DC for Otakon. Baltimore does have a reputation, and the riots of a couple years ago didn't help any. But cities all across the United States have the same types of risks to them. DC still has violent crime that includes muggings and drug-related violence. So I want to start off with some basic city safety tips that you can use in any city. For starters, be aware of your surroundings. The more alert you are to what is going on around you, the better off you will be. By taking a moment to look around you, you actually increase your safety exponentially. By simply taking stock of what goes on around you helps you to keep from getting lost. You notice the people around you, and that helps prevent anything bad happening to you. It has been proven by police interviews with criminals that criminals are far less inclined to hurt or mug you if you seem to be aware. Criminals only go after people who are not paying attention and seem self-absorbed, like talking on their cell phones or listening to their earbuds. They rarely go after a person once that person sees them. Keep a map on you, either a physical map or one on your cell. Review it before leaving your hotel or the convention center and decide on the best route to take. This is more important to do in DC than in Baltimore, as the city is divided into quadrants, and knowing where the closest metro stops are key for you to get around. This will also help prevent you from walking into a really bad neighborhood. And speaking of bad neighborhoods, generally speaking, stay out of the southeast quadrant of Washington, D.C., especially the Anacostia neighborhood. There are parts of the southwest quadrant that aren't great either. However, like Baltimore, you really have to go out of your way to get into a bad neighborhood. Travel in pairs or in groups. Never ever by yourself. Very simple. The more of you there are, the less likely someone is going to mess with you. Very simple. And if at all possible, don't walk around late at night, especially in areas that aren't well lit. And if you must, again, travel with someone or a group, or at least try to get a cab or Uber. More on that later. Don't feed bums or give them money. I know you're all very nice people and you want to help out, but don't do this. There are plenty of soup kitchens and ways for the homeless to be taken care of. If you give them food or money, you will be marked for it and they will follow you or look for you later on. The word will go out and you may find yourself surrounded. When you are asked for money or food, don't stop moving, just keep walking and simply say, sorry, no. And lastly, keep your bags and backpacks on your person and your wallets and cells in your pockets. Never just set them down on a sidewalk, on a bench, or on a table. They will be snatched up in a nanosecond. Now, those are some quick tips for you as you go to Otakon. No matter what city you are in, for whatever reason, these are usually good rules to follow, so please follow them. Now that we have the basic rules out of the way, let's talk about Washington, D.C. in particular. It is a different city than Baltimore was, and in many ways, it has a different vibe and feel to it, a completely different culture. Many feel that it is a safer place than Baltimore, and in many respects, it is. But there are some things you need to understand about DC. Now, in case you're wondering why I consider myself an expert in DC, let me give you a quick little personal history that I have with Washington, DC. I was born there. I spent a large part of my life in the DC metro area, growing up in Montgomery County, Maryland. I have also worked in DC in several different places, Smithsonian and the Arena Stage. And there are reasons why I chose to live in Baltimore as opposed to DC. So when I talk about DC, I have a little bit of experience and I kind of know what I'm talking about. The first thing you should know is that DC is, on the whole, not the most friendly city, even though it is a city where millions of tourists worldwide come to visit. I'm not saying that those in DC will go out of their way to get in your face, it's just that they don't really have time for you. Washington, D.C. is a place of business and government. They will be talking on their cells and will walk into your shoulder and keep on going and not say, excuse me. If you move too slowly, always stay to the right so you can be passed. Otherwise, someone will get in your face for slowing them down. Except for those in the tourism industry, the citizens of DC and those who work there have no use for tourists. Trust me, just stay out of their way. Now, if for some godforsaken reason you are driving in DC, never drive over a bridge that goes over a body of water. Sounds odd, but trust me, you will wind up in a place you do not want to be, either in a bad neighborhood or somewhere in Virginia or somewhere in Maryland. Okay, let's talk a little bit about firearms in Washington, D.C. D.C. laws are constantly changing. I strongly urge you to keep any firearms at home. It just isn't worth the hassle. But if you must bring a firearm with you, please, before you leave, look up the current laws before showing up to Otakon. The convention center and the con itself prohibits them. And the big difference in DC is that if you do try to bring one into Otakon, you won't simply be tossed out. You will find yourself in a small room explaining to both local and federal authorities why you have a firearm on you and why you brought it to the convention. Okay, this one is for you cosplayers and your cosplay weapons. For the love of God, do not carry your cosplay weapons outside of the convention center. Carry them disassembled and packed away when you are outside of the con. Here's why. Washington, D.C. is the capital of America. There are high-ranking officials from not only our own government, but from other governments. There is a lot of tourism here, which means that there are a lot of soft targets for terrorists. There are rallies and protests that go on in D.C. all the time. Security against threats is very real here. If someone thinks you are a threat, the following will happen, and it has happened. Armed authorities will show up out of nowhere and draw down on you with real firearms. You will be placed in handcuffs. All of your belongings will be taken and searched, and might be kept. You will be taken to a small room to be interrogated for a number of hours, if not days. I am not joking. I am being serious. This happens quite more frequently than you think. As I've said before, Washington, D.C. is a city, which means that it has city problems. Having said that, I will say that violent crime, especially where the convention center is at, isn't much of an issue. However, the crimes you do need to be aware of are things like pickpocketing and scammers. You're in a city that gets a lot of tourists, and tourists tend to be easy pickings for lesser crimes like having your wallet picked or your cell lifted. Now, having said all that about Washington, D.C., there are actually a couple good things you should know. First, the convention center is in a part of town that is heavily patrolled by local and federal authorities. That means in terms of regular crime, you are pretty darn safe. Also, the surrounding neighborhood really isn't that bad either. The other thing is that there is a metro stop that is literally underneath the convention center. So if you're relying on metro, you're going to have it pretty easy and it's going to be a little bit more safer for you. So in terms of safety for Washington, D.C., that is D.C. in a nutshell. Use a little common sense, just as you would in any city, and you will be just fine. Now let's talk about something that has people on edge right now, particularly with Otaku: rallies and protests.